Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, in Dante's Inferno, the deepest circle of hell is where Satan himself resides, trapped in a frozen lake of blood and guilt, far from any source of light and warmth. Now, this week, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon told the world that he had found the deepest circle of hell right here on Earth, in Syria's Yarmouk refugee camp. Now, it's a place where blown-out buildings stand as empty shells, where Islamist extremists reportedly play football with decapitated heads, and where the few thousand civilians who haven't managed to escape face the prospect of death every hour they remain. It's also a place where all the horror of Syria's war is on display for the world to see. So what's the world doing about it? Is it doing anything? My guest today is Mouin Rabbani. He's a Palestinian specialist. He's also co-editor of an online magazine, Jadaliyya, which sort of roughly means the debate. He also served very briefly on the staff of the UN Special Envoy to Syria, Staffan de Mistura. He's written a lot about the Middle East, about Syria, and what he admits is an incomprehensibly complex conflict. Thanks for being here today, sir. Since I identified you as a Palestinian specialist, I'd like to ask you about Yarmouk itself. We keep saying it's a refugee camp. It's been around for decades. It was originally built, right, for Palestinians who were fleeing from the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Here's a naive question, but I'm really wondering, why has it been there in the first place for decades? Why were these people holed up in a camp all of these decades?
Well, Yarmouk is actually not no official refugee camps that dot the occupied territories and surrounding Arab countries. It's It's a neighborhood of Damascus on the southern approaches to Damascus that was established in the 1950s, and the Palestinian population is there for a simple reason. They were largely ethnically cleansed from their homeland during the 1948 war and the establishment of Israel, and more importantly, have been denied the right to return to their homes ever since. And that's why Yarmouk, like many of the refugee camps, continue to exist. It's actually fairly simple in that respect. Yarmouk itself, on the eve of the Syrian conflict, had a Palestinian population of approximately 150,000 residents who lived amongst what in recent years is estimated to be approximately 1 million Syrians, and including also Iraqi refugees. It's considered the main locus of Palestinians and Palestinian life in Syria, and has played a significant role in the development of the contemporary Palestinian national movement.
You said on the eve of this war in 2011, and yet since really the end of, I guess, 2012, it has been under constant first siege and bombardment by the Syrian government forces. And now, since
Correct.
April 1st, it's been under, and even adding insult to injury, the Islamic State storms in. We're told they have 90% control of the camp right now, the Islamic State group. Where did they come from? Did they just cross the street and enter the camp?
You could say that. They came primarily from an adjoining neighborhood called al-Hajar al-Aswad, and of course there have been questions raised given the almost airtight siege of Yarmouk during the past 2 to 3 years, how they managed to get in so easily. And I think it's important to note that Yarmouk and the Palestinians in Syria generally lie at the center, if you will, of 3 concurrent conflicts. The first is the internal Palestinian division, primarily between Fatah and Hamas. The second is, of course, the conflict between the Syrian government and Syrian opposition. And the third is the increasingly bitter and violent rivalry between various Syrian opposition factions. And so all these factors have more or less come into play in the past several weeks in Yarmouk.
As you describe it, it's obviously extremely complex, extremely confusing. But, you know, we've spoken to some analysts here at France 24 who have said that essentially in the early days, the Syrian government was teaming up with, was working in tandem with the Islamic State group while they pounded away at the other rebels in the camp to wipe them out. What do you make of that assertion?
I, I, I think it's very difficult to prove. On the one hand, the Syrian government obviously has an interest in fomenting conflict between various rival opposition factions. At the same time, I think it's entirely legitimate to question whether the Syrian government would in fact have an interest in giving the Islamic State movement a significant foothold only kilometers from the very center of the capital, Damascus. I think these kinds of assertions are very easy to make, and it's possible to muster all kinds of circumstantial evidence for them, but at the same time, I think, rather difficult to prove.
Difficult to prove. You were, we've gotten reports just today, actually, that Palestinian militants in Yarmouk camp actually have reached an agreement with the Syrian leadership to jointly fight the Islamic State group. And you were telling me just before we went on air that already the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah is denying this. So there's splits within the among the Palestinians themselves.
There are all kinds of splits, and I think you know, there are fundamental reasons for the crisis in Yarmouk that relate, of course, to the Syrian context of the conflict. But at the same time, I think it also reflects the division within Palestinian ranks, and to put it quite simply, the absence of genuine and credible national leadership among the Palestinians themselves. And so therefore you had, for example, a member of the PLO Executive Committee who just concluded a visit to Damascus from one of the pro-Syrian factions, basically reaching an agreement with the Syrian government that there would be something along the lines of a joint assault on Yarmouk, and would presumably result in the obliteration of anything that's still left standing there. While, you know, moments later, the Palestinian leadership, Mahmoud Abbas, in Ramallah denied that such an agreement had been reached. You know, a lot has been said that the Palestinians should have pursued a policy of neutrality with regard to the Syrian conflict. I think it's a nice principle, but in fact it reflects the level of Palestinian integration into the Syrian fabric over the course of the past 6 decades, which I think is fair to say has been greater and more successful than in any other Arab state. That has made it virtually impossible for Palestinians to remain neutral. And so we see Palestinians essentially falling on both sides of the Syrian divide. I think what points to a clear failure of leadership here, of Palestinian leadership, is the inability of the Palestinians to act as a unified force. And here I think there's been an important transformation of sorts. If you recall that prior to the Syrian conflict, the Palestinian movement Fatah had had a very problematic relationship with Damascus, stretching in fact back to the mid-1960s, while the Islamist Hamas movement had in Syria a strategic ally for much of the past decade or two. They've essentially shifted positions now, where Hamas in effect broke with Damascus, and one of the main Palestinian armed factions in Yarmouk, Aknaf Beit al-Maqdis, is affiliated with Hamas and affiliated with the armed Syrian opposition, while Fatah has taken a much more pro-regime stance, if you will.
Let me ask you this. I mentioned at the beginning that you very briefly, you did resign, but you were working on the staff of the UN Special Envoy, Staffan de Mistura. You were highly critical in a recent article about his sort of policy of trying to freeze conflicts, especially in Aleppo. And your suggestion is really that this whole strategy is only leading to a lot more suffering and not helping end this conflict in any way.
Well, the issue here is, I think, more the way that the initiative was pursued rather than the principle of the initiative itself. For reasons that remain beyond me, the UN Special Envoy decided to focus exclusively on achieving a temporary cessation of violence exclusively in one city, as opposed to looking more broadly at Syria and seeing where else such initiatives might be pursued, while at the same time looking also at other things.
Maybe he was just trying to be, just to play devil's advocate, maybe he was just trying to be realistic. He was trying to do what he thought might be feasible in the short term.
Well, if you're trying to be realistic, then you would start with widespread consultations about where such an initiative might have the greatest chance of success, rather than simply announcing that you're going to begin in what is in fact one of the most complex environments and one of the largest Syrian, or the largest Syrian city. And therefore I wasn't at all surprised that this was essentially reduced to a gimmick to produce a ceasefire in only one neighborhood of Aleppo, and even then never got off the ground. It was just, you know,
it's been intractable. But this conflict, there's been not only no easy way out, there's been no semi-easy way out. We unfortunately are running out of time, sir, but I just want to remind our viewers that a few weeks ago there was a satellite image of Syria. 83% of it plunged into darkness. Millions of Syrians internally displaced. In a nutshell, do you know how many of those civilians UN agencies have access to, very briefly?
I don't, and there's of course a significant difference between Syrians displaced within Syria and those who are refugees outside Syria. For those within Syria, particularly those in areas that are difficult to reach, in opposition-held areas, I think the humanitarian access is a much more difficult proposition.
Yep. Okay, Mr. Rabbani, unfortunately we do have to leave it there, and we're not going to solve this conflict today. It's been defying the world's diplomats. I'll remind our viewers that there's also a Russian initiative underway to try to broker some peace. Hopefully we'll get you back here and we'll get another assessment and see how things are moving in a few months' time, but thanks very much for